What the Cluck session 63. Today we're going to talk about how to keep rodents out of your chicken coop during the winter, guys. Hi there and welcome to this session of What the Cluck, a podcast devoted to keeping chickens for fun and self-sufficiency. I'm Mayant from Frugal Chicken, and in this episode we're going to talk all about how to keep rodents out of your chicken coop during the winter, and it does seem to be a particular issue. It's an issue all year long, let's face it, but it's particularly an issue in the winter because it gets cold, right? So that's what we're going to talk about this week. Now, before we get started, this episode is sponsored by Upon Poultry, and I've partnered with Upon Poultry because I believe that their feed is some of the best on the market. Now, winter is coming up, and you do have to be concerned about keeping your chickens on a good diet and helping them maintain their weight so that they can stay warm as the weather gets colder. And ManaPro has a full array of non-GMO organic chicken feed. So from the time that your chicken is an itty-bitty chick until the time that she is a full-grown, gorgeous layer, you can be sure that she is getting the best nutrition possible. So the next time that you're in the feed store, or maybe you're new to chickens and you're not quite sure what to give your chickens to make sure that they have the best diet possible as the cold weather sets in, I want to encourage you to go grab a bag of ManaPro's non-GMO organic feed. You can visit ManaPro at www.manapro.com. So let's get on to our episode, which, as I've said a couple times now, is about how to keep rodents out of your chicken coop over the winter. And this really is a problem. It's a problem, any time of the year, but it's particularly a problem when the cold weather sets in. And as you can probably figure out, there's not much for rodents to really eat. So rodents, we're talking about like mice and rats and, that sort of thing. There's not that much for them to eat anymore, and they're going to go where the food is easiest to find, which is usually in chicken coops. And I know for us, it's a huge problem. And believe it or not, it's less of an issue in our chicken coop than it is in our house. Kind of embarrassed to admit that, but we live in the country and we live in a very old farmhouse. And last winter, we had a terrible problem with mice. Like, I can't even begin to tell you how terrible it was. It was ridiculous. And so that's why we got our cat, Simba. And Simba has done an excellent job of cleaning up the mice situation. And we know Simba's doing his job, one, because we don't have any mice. We don't regularly see mice in our house. And in farmhouses, in homesteads, you're going to see mice every so often. It's just a fact of country living. In the cities and the suburbs so much, we didn't have any of these problems. But old country houses, middle of nowhere, it's just sort of a fact of life, honestly. But we know Simba's doing his job also because we find half-dead mouse, pretty frequently around our house. So yeah, that's pretty gross. I have stepped on my share of half-eaten mice in the middle of the night as I've gone up to go to the bathroom. But yeah, so Simba's, really doing a very excellent job of keeping the mice down. So in your chicken coop, it does turn into kind of an issue because, like I said, there's not much for them to eat. It's cold out. They're going to go where it's warm and where there's, easy access to food. And even on our farm, we feed our horses obviously outside and we feed them in feed buckets, but, the horses throw the food everywhere. It's just, their nature. And every so often I, go to fill up a bucket after a few hours of, it's the next, time to feed them. And I see mice scatter everywhere. So it's just kind of, how it is when it comes to country living and having chickens and, grain laying around. But let's move on to what you can do to prevent them. Now, in this episode, we're only going to talk about how to prevent them. In an upcoming episode, we'll talk about how to get rid of them once you do have them. We'll touch a little bit on it in this episode, but for the most part, we're going to talk about how to prevent them. Now, as I've mentioned a couple times already, sort of the number one thing that attracts mice and rats into your chicken coop is easy access to food. So, it stands to reason that the number one way to prevent mice and rats in your chicken coop is to not make it easy for them to get food. And I know this is kind of hard, especially, if you have open feeders, you want your chickens to have 24-hour access to feed. I know that can get kind of hard, but it is, really the number one way to prevent them. If there's no food, they're going to go elsewhere to look for food. It's pretty simple. So let's talk about how you can do that. Obviously, a secure container is the number one thing you should use. And, when it comes to secure containers, it's not just, what's in their coop, obviously for the chickens to eat, it's also how you store it, because obviously you're not putting out a full 50-pound bag of feed or chicken feed in the coop at one time. Or maybe you are, and then you can still use some of these ideas, but in most cases, you're probably not putting it all out at once. So mice, as you may or may not know, are very, very good at chewing through feed bags. Feed bags are meant to keep feed clean and to make it, easy to pour it around, easy to carry around. But as for keeping rodents away, the feed bags just aren't going to do it. And and mice can very easily just chew through it. So you're going to need to use some sort of container. Now, you have a couple of choices here. You can go with something like a big trash can, and we've used those, or you can go with something like a metal container. Both are equally good. If you're going to go with a plastic container, you want to go with something that's like thicker and has some sort of rubber element to it. Mice and rats, if they are feeling very industrious, they can actually chew through plastic. If that is an issue in your area, in your home, in your chicken coop, you might want to go ahead and go with metal. But we've had success with plastic, and I like it because it's easy to clean, it's easy to sanitize, that sort of thing. But the number one thing, too, to make sure is that you have a top that cannot be easily accessed by, a mouse or a rodent. So some plastic containers out there you might find have easy to snap on lids, and believe it or not, those are not the best to use. Mice and rodents, if they can get, they can get into the tiniest little cracks, I'm telling you. So if they can get into it, they will get into it. So I like to go with something that's very, very securely on there. Maybe use a bungee cord or two to absolutely secure it on there. If you have a plastic top and it's not quite fitting the way that you want it to do, you can put a plastic bag, in between the top itself and the plastic container to sort of give it that sort of extra secure element to it. But those are two ideas that I personally like to use. Now, moving on to the metal containers, obviously metal trash cans or some sort of metal container is another option. Again, with that, those tend to have better fitting lids than plastic containers do or plastic trash cans do. So that's probably less of an issue. And obviously, if it's metal, rats and mice can't really chew through it. So if you have a large infestation or they happen to be particularly aggressive or plastic hungry, the metal trash can is a good option. And, it will keep your food fresh. It will keep it secure to keep it away from, other predators like raccoons that can, also be attracted by feed during the winter. Now, it also stands to reason, though, that if you are securing your feed, if you're trying to not attract any sort of rodents, making sure that the coop and your chicken's run is clean is equally important. It's one thing to keep everything else secure, but if you're sort of throwing feed in there and not really keeping it clean, that's still going to attract mice. And we have sort of that issue with some of our rabbit cages. We've recently sort of realized that now that it's getting colder, mice are getting through some of the cages and feeding on the rabbit feed. And I know this because I've never actually seen it. I'm not going to lie, I've never seen it. But I know it's an issue because I know these particular rabbits don't eat as much as I'm giving them. And obviously I'm never going to let the rabbits go without feed. So even if I think something else is getting in there and getting it, I'm still going to put it in there so that the rabbits have, 24-hour access to their feed. But the whole point of what I'm trying to say right now is that it makes sense in your chicken coop, if you think you have rodents, to go ahead and just remove as much feed as you can. So if you have a dirt floor, go ahead and just, rake everything up and then throw it out, or, put it into a bin where rodents can't get to it. If you do leave feed in there, 24 hours a day, reconsider that, especially at night, if rodents are an issue. Your chickens don't necessarily need 24-hour access to feed. At night, they're not going to be eating. They're going to be roosting. They're going to be, sleeping, that sort of thing. They're not necessarily going to be eating or drinking. It's just not part of their natural circadian rhythm. So they really only need access to feed during the day. Now, on our farm, we actually have designated feed times. We feed them in the morning and then we feed them again at night. That's just our rhythm here. But that also helps make sure that there's not excess feed in there 24 hours a day. And as we all know, mice and rats, they'll be around 24 hours a day, but they're more active at night because it's quiet, because they're less likely to be disturbed. So consider removing the feed at night if you do want them to have access to it 24 hours a day, or just access to it whenever they want it. They really don't actually need it at night. Now, we talked about feed, but there's also another very simple thing that you can do to prevent rodents in your chicken coop, and that's just to make sure that you have a coop that's fairly secure. And what I mean by this is, there's no real holes in the wall. If you do have, ventilation, like you have gaps, in the roof for ventilation, or you have windows for ventilation, what you can do is you can put hardware cloth on there to help keep the rodents out. And I know in some of our coops, we have one coop in particular that is older. It's a, turn of the century, turn of the 20th century, that is, building. And it has a wood floor, and we do have to go over it every winter to patch up pieces of the floor that may have, gotten dislodged over the summer. Like I said, it's a very old building. So, we do that just to sort of keep the snake and the rat population down in there. And in that particular coop, it's not so much of an issue, particularly though, because we do that. So if you have, small cracks in your coop, or you have small cracks, maybe you're using a shed like we do, and it has, cracks in it, go ahead and just cover those up. If you have a window for ventilation, like I said, go ahead and cover it with hardware cloth to keep everybody out. It's definitely important that you have the windows in there. It's definitely important that you have some sort of ventilation. But if you're concerned, if you want to keep the mice and the rats out, go ahead and just put hardware cloth over it. And the other thing that you should do is make sure that the door shuts securely tight, that there's no sort of a centimeter crack in between the door and the wall that some mouse can get in it. And, as we know, once mice are in there, it's kind of hard to get rid of them. So it's always better to prevent them. Now, when it comes to your coop, something else that you can do is just make sure that you clean up any straw that you might use or shavings that you might use. If you use something on the floor, or maybe the shavings or the straws in their nesting boxes, make sure that you clean it out consistently, or that you at least toss it and dislodge it a little bit. And the reason for this is because mice and rats will nest in it. And they may very well even nest in your nesting boxes if given the opportunity. But by aerating the straw and the shavings, by just tossing them in the air and just giving some sort of life to it, you know what I'm saying? That will go ahead and prevent any nests from consistently existing. Obviously, within 24 hours, a mouse is probably going to rebuild its nest. But if you're doing it consistently, it sort of hammers home the point. And, mice are creatures of habit also. And if they can't easily nest, if they can't easily stay warm, they're not going to, hang around. They're going to go look for an easier place to live. So if you're consistently doing that, if you're consistently cleaning it out, that will help keep the population down. As something that you do, as a standalone activity, it's not going to necessarily prevent them, but it's something that you can use in conjunction with the other ideas in this podcast. Now, my favorite way to get rid of mice or to prevent mice is actually, and I've talked about this in this episode, is to have a cat. This is obviously not something that everybody can do. Some people are allergic and you can't necessarily take advantage of the presence of a cat. But in my experience, to get rid of mice, cats are the best. A close second is dogs. Obviously, Simba is our cat. I should back up a bit. Simba is our cat. Simba does not go outside. He is a indoor only kitty cat. That's just how we've chosen to raise him. But when we had a dog and our dog lived outside, we didn't even have any rodents. We had no rodents, no rats, no squirrels, no rabbits hanging around. And now that we don't have a dog anymore, it's becoming more of a consistent issue of having sort of minor pests around. I don't really consider mice and rabbits and squirrels real pests. To me, real pests are things like cockroaches and nasty stuff like that. But they are, kind of minor pests, especially squirrels when they eat my walnuts. We were going to have a great walnut harvest this year, and the squirrels ate them all. So we have exactly 0 walnuts this year. But anyways, I digress. When we had our dog, we didn't have issues of rats and mice out there. So this goes to show that having a dog, having some sort of predator around that will get rid of them is, really an excellent way to prevent mice and rats. They're not going to want to hang around if they think that they're going to get chased by a dog or eaten by a dog. So if you do have the opportunity, if you have a huge rodent mess and you're not quite sure what to do, and you have room in your life for a dog or a cat, I heavily, heavily recommend it. Obviously, you shouldn't adopt an animal or go out and get an animal solely for the purposes of preventing mice and rats. But if it fits into your lifestyle, if you welcome another pet in your home, do consider it. Now, the final two things that you can do to prevent mice and rats in your coop over the winter is to keep trash to a minimum around your chicken coop. Trash being, food or whatever, whatever you have for dinner, any sort of trash, bags of chips that you may have thrown aside, keep that to a minimum. Obviously, trash is a huge attractor of rodents. We all know this. No matter where you live, whether you're living in a city or the suburbs or the country like we do, if you have trash, you're going to have rodents. It's pretty simple. So keep the trash to a minimum. Now, the final thing that you can do is, if possible, cut any sort of like tall bushes or plants or whatever that you might have around your coop. Cut them low or remove them altogether, because tall plants or bushes can actually provide great hideouts for mice and rats. Now, obviously, this is not going to be something that everybody can do, by virtue of the fact that if you happen to have landscaped your coop or you have plants that you don't necessarily want to dig up, obviously, that's not something necessarily that you're going to want to do. However, if you have plants and you don't mind getting rid of them, this is an option for you. Just simply remove them or cut them low, remove the ability for a rat to hide underneath them. So this is the end of this week's podcast. It's a little bit shorter this week. I hope you've enjoyed it and that it's given you some ideas of how to keep mice and rats away from your coop this winter. And if you do have any ideas of your own, if you have anything that you would like other chicken owners to know about, definitely go ahead and email me at editor@thefrugalchicken.com. And I will go ahead and feature that on a future episode so that we can go ahead and make sure that listeners have all the information that they need or new ideas that I may not have thought of to keep pests out of the coop over the winter. I do want to encourage you to go grab my book, Chickens Naturally Raising a Sustainable Flock. In that book, there's a lot of ideas for keeping your chickens healthy over the winter and over the summer, obviously, but also over the winter, ideas for how to feed them and all that sort of fun stuff. There's all sorts of recipes in there. It's a really great book. I'm very proud of it. So go ahead and grab a copy of that at thefrugalchicken.com/chickenbook. Thank you for listening to this episode of What the Cluck, and I'll see you next time.